Hello, and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and books, and should have picked a much shorter thing to say at the start of my videos. And I'm joined today by my good friend, Dr. Philip Chase. Say hello, Philip.
Hello, everybody. Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you, AP.
And I have an extra special guest, the High Fist himself, the Malazan expert, Ruthan Badd.
Thank you, AP. I finally feel like a made man. Thank you for having me here.
Oh yes, you have joined the Irish Mafia on my channel. So today we are discussing The Lees of Laughter's End, the second of the Bauchelain and Korbal Broach novellas. It's the second one in the sequence of three, and they are in a collected edition, which Philip is very kindly holding up there. And we have already discussed on Philip's channel, we discussed Blood Follows, which is the first one. And on Ruthan Badd's channel, we're going to be discussing the Healthy Dead, the third one. So this is the second in a trilogy of videos. Just because, you know, it's fantasy, we should do it in trilogies.
Absolutely.
But, before I start obviously shooting off my mouth and rambling incoherently for long periods of time, as I am wont to do, I would like to extend the invitation to my guests for a change to have the first word. So Ruthan, if you please, would you like to start on this one?
Well, if you were looking for an alternative for rambling, AP, asking me to speak about a Bauchelain book would not really be your best strategic move, but I will try to be precise here. This is one of those, I enjoyed it a lot more. I'll be honest, I enjoyed it a lot more when I read it again. This was, I did enjoy it the first time as well, but not as much as the first and the third ones. This is something that I really had to get used to because, number one, as you pointed out in, I think Philip's, the video that we did on Philip's channel, if you're not familiar with the whole ghost story on a ship trope that we see in sort of literature, there might be certain elements here that we might not really appreciate. And I probably fall into that category. To me, this was more of a, what I liked about it was that this, even though I feel that the story and the dialogue and the characterization is not perhaps as good as the first and the third one, what this one does amazingly is slapstick comedy, as in just in terms of Three Stooges type. That is so difficult to write because it's so difficult for the meter, the sort of the cadence of the prose to be right, where we feel that movement and motion and the sudden surprise and the silliness of it, that one guy who just keeps getting injured over and over again. There's such a, this I feel, and I'm not a, you guys are literary experts, I'm not, but I feel that this can be studied and dissected simply for how slapstick comedy can be, the words to use, the sentences to use, how slapstick comedy can translate into the written page, because I find that to be a skill that almost no writer has these days. There are many different types of humor, but just this kind of physical, as I was saying, Three Stooges, Naked Gun type comedy almost. It's nearly impossible to get it in a literary form, and I think that is the biggest triumph of this story. I did warn you I would ramble.
Sorry. Yeah. Good stuff.
And Philip, do you have anything to add to that opening salvo?
I think he hit the nail on the head. This, for me, was the most slapstick of the three, and I haven't read the rest of the novellas, but of the three that we read together, I would say that the most satirical was the one that is on Ruthan Badd's channel, the Healthy Dead. And this one is definitely the most slapstick. And I have to confess that I was laughing the most. I was laughing out loud, snorting and having a great time. And I don't know what this says about me, but I was just, you mentioned Gus Hub. He's the unfortunate fellow that even now I have a hard time not laughing, who had one bit of himself chopped off after another. I mean, the point where the desiccated corpse of the mother that was up in the mast's head, when she fell on him and the one finger pokes out his eye, I was absolutely, I mean, I was helplessly laughing for I don't know how long after that. And I think my wife thought something was wrong with me. But I mean, this one is very funny, but what does it say about me? That I don't know. I have a very primitive sense of humor, I guess. I like.
It says you have no heart, Philip.
I have no heart. But the fact is, there is something, I mentioned this earlier too, in one of our discussions, I forget which one now, but about humor. I think it was the one on my channel about humor and where it comes from. And what are we laughing at when we're laughing? We often do laugh at pain, and it is a response to pain and to fear. And who knows, is there some evolutionary reason for this, that when we're laughing, we are assuring somehow that things are going to be okay? Who knows? I don't think anyone knows for sure, but oh my goodness, I just had a great time reading this story.
It's, you know, to be perfectly honest, I really wish someone would come up with a word like schadenfreude to describe laughing at someone else's pain.
Yeah.
But you know, and this might be slightly repetitive for people who have watched the other videos, but obviously we have to outline here. These books are darkly comic. They are absurdist comedy. They are transgressive in that they're looking at specifically making fun of taboos and breaching those taboos, and they are horrendously dark, biting, satirical parodies. So, just to warn anyone who hasn't seen the other videos, like, we are talking about very dark humor here. And like we see someone who has pieces of themselves cut off and damaged repeatedly through it for the sake of comedy. And it is darkly comic that they are this so unlucky that this keeps happening to them. And it's almost like an exaggeration of, there was an old Simpsons joke of the someone winning the Oscar for man getting football in the groin, and all it is was the guy getting the football hitting him and him falling down and crying in pain and everyone laughing. And you go, there is an element of that here, that we are looking at physical absurdist horror comedy, where it is, elements of it are gross out humor, elements of it are really just dark. And I think if you can appreciate that style of humor and appreciate that that's the tone and tenor of these novels, like, I would have to warn people, don't go into reading these going, oh yes, I'm a big fan of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, or I'm a fan of Dostoevsky, and start reading this and expecting that type of literature, because this is not going to land that way.
Yeah, but at the same time, there are some really fundamental human truths in here too. I think we've all had Gust Hub days, I think, haven't we? When you just feel like the world is against you, that somehow it is one ridiculous accident after another, and you think, oh, what next? You know, and then
I just call that life, Philip.
Yeah, and then some old lady pokes your eye out. I mean, it just that's how life is, and you know, these stories get at some real deep things about us, that we are creatures that are, you know, fearful and lustful and all of these things. I mean, this is humanity. So,
well, let me first direct a question to Ruthan, and then to you, Philip. But
sure.
One of the things that was pointed out to me by my wife was looking at Korbal Broach, a eunuch unable to have children, and he creates, in the best way that he can, a monstrous child in a Dr. Frankenstein-esque way, in a horror parody way. But his drive to have his own child, to reproduce. Now, it is presented in horror here, but this is a humanizing aspect of Korbal Broach as a character, who is genuinely depicted and generally depicted as the monstrous other, as this caricature. But this particular element, I wanted your thoughts on it, because it's one of those ones that, when you start thinking about it, sticks out in my mind as actually quite profound. So, Ruthan, your thoughts?
So this would be a lot more fitting if people have seen the discussion we've had on the previous videos about the nature of whether Bauchelain is evil or not. AP, you are absolutely right. This whole desire to beget, this whole desire to have a child is a very human desire, and it humanizes Korbal Broach. And who is the only character who has any kind of empathy or compassion for that basic desire that Korbal Broach has? It's Bauchelain. He's the only one who refers to that as a child, while the rest of them refer to that as a monstrosity, while the rest of them are constantly, I mean, Rhys himself constantly treats it with sort of total horror and disgust. The only person who understands that this is something meaningful to Korbal Broach, and the only person who understands that this is a sort of a mentally unhinged eunuch necromancer's version of genuinely wanting a child. I mean, I shouldn't really exploit that, milk that too much to make Bauchelain sound like a more morally positive character. But since you brought it up, I do think that it's an important thing that Bauchelain's the only one who has empathy for Korbal Broach's desires. And in terms of this story being so dark and morbid and gruesome, one of the best sort of what encapsulates that best is that Korbal Broach gets more screen time in this story than Bauchelain does. This is the only story that I can think of where Korbal Broach himself plays a much more prominent character, sort of role than, as in he's hunting for the lich, he's using his child. I mean, I have empathy for Korbal Broach as well, right? He uses his child. Bauchelain essentially turns up in the end to have a showdown with that incoming god, and that doesn't go anywhere. But in terms of being a part of the slapstick humor, the fishing line where he uses the ear to fish and he gives it back to that guy, he lets him hold it and he just walks away. Korbal Broach to me seemed to be much more prominent in this than in the other two, which I again think is kind of symbolic of how this is in many ways a lot more absurdist and gruesome than the others.
Yeah, interesting. What is it that Richard Dawkins calls us in The Selfish Gene? Survival machines. We are essentially survival machines for our genes that we are meant to pass on. Yeah, I mean, Korbal Broach's desire to have some kind of child is something that does indeed humanize him to some degree, I think, in this story. And I felt a degree of sympathy for him. He kind of looks like a big baby himself, I guess, right? But it's interesting because he's not someone you would initially feel sympathy for, and it is possible that the oddballs, you know, that the people that are deemed to be in some way deviant are the ones who get the least sympathy traditionally. But when you get a look behind the veil and you see their humanity, it can be very touching and it can be transformative. So it is interesting, I think, that Korbal Broach gets the attention in this story. And you know the rest of the stories better than I do, so I didn't know that he was never really at center stage in the other stories. That's not what I meant. In this collection, he's quite clearly sort of, this is the story where, at least in my reading, he shines the most, because he's much more of an enigma in the other two. Whereas here we actually see him deal, which we follow him, which we don't in the first and third. I think deviant is such a sort of perfect word to describe these guys, just the double deviance of the two of them. I mean, so that's what I meant, right? Korbal Broach is, and he has the most dialogue of by far, I think, in this story than in the other ones. And I mean,
he giggles a lot, Philip, come on.
He giggles in his high voice. And so there's so many things about him that trigger in the reader this sense of unease. There are so many things that don't go together very well from a very, I guess you could say, traditional perspective. The high voice, and he's this big hulking guy at the same time, and so there's so many things that creep us out about him. But when you look behind the character a little bit, I think that's a pretty interesting perspective you've offered there. So,
are we being too kind here? People might be listening to this wondering, I mean, and
Well,
just imagining that homunculus with the rat tails and the hearts and all that.
But this is
We
what I
are
was about
madmen.
this was what I was about to point out, that okay, yeah, we can understand this impetus, but he has just carved up a bunch of dead bodies, sewn the pieces together, then killed a bunch of rats, used their tails, their feet, their noses, their mouths, sewed that all on, and then let the thing loose on the ship. Like, let's not oversell this yet. I think this is one of the hallmarks of Erikson's writing, even in something as dark, as absurdist, as horror driven as this, that there is an underlying complexity. There's an underlying nuance that it is so easy to overlook because, again, we get carried away with the surface level story. We get carried away with the surface level jokes. But underlying all of it is quite often something complex, something nuanced, something that challenges base assumptions. Korbal Broach is evil. Korbal Broach looks monstrous. But Korbal Broach is a freed slave who had been made a eunuch against his will. So that explains why he is overweight. It explains his strangely high-pitched voice.
Right.
He cannot have kids. So how can he create a child? Well, that could explain his interest in necromancy. Does it explain why he's a sociopathic serial killer? Maybe not. But these characters, despite being over the top, exaggerated, evil, are actually still complex and interesting, even at that level.
Yeah.
I wonder if his mutilation has sort of, whether it's been explicitly, I can't recall in the other stories, where it's explicitly connected to his need to mutilate people and collect their body parts. The fact that he himself was, maybe we will find out that his genitals were used in a similar endeavor or something like that. I mean, the fact that his body parts are missing might be why he wants to sew body parts together. Or there might be references in the other stories that are missing out. I don't know.
I don't think any of the other novellas have gone back to his childhood. I don't think we've had any of those analeptic sequences. But,
I hope they do.
I'm not sure. I hope they do, because their current adventures are bad enough. I don't really want to know what happened to them as children.
But I want to find out what makes them tick, because even though the Bauchelain and Korbal Broach interaction is so limited, it's almost like a father-son. Notice how Bauchelain speaks. He's always extremely polite. He's always extremely kind when he speaks, courteous when he speaks to him. And Korbal Broach always speaks to Bauchelain with an underlying sense of respect as well. Even when the two rat catchers confront them at the end of the first story, it's very clear that Korbal Broach almost starts whining to Bauchelain. He says, kill them. I'm scared of them. They give me a bad feeling. And Bauchelain is always very polite, very kind, very courteous when he talks to Korbal Broach. It's clear that he understands that there's something off with this guy and that he needs to be spoken to in a sort of in a neutral way instead of being treated like a deviant. So I would like to see how that happened and how they hooked up. That's the only reason.
And there's a really interesting moment, and it's only one line, but in Lisa Laughter's End, Korbal Broach goes to get something out of a chest, and he just reaches down, dismisses all of Bauchelain's words, and opens it up. And Bauchelain looks at him and goes, "It's quite humbling when you do that."
Humbling, yeah.
And this is Bauchelain we see as the scholar, the arcanist, who has all of this obscure knowledge, who is so powerful. And Korbal Broach, without any effort, without any thought, can just bypass all of this stuff. That in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, we see it takes one of the smartest characters of the series to look at, to work out, to try and find a technique. Here, Korbal Broach just walks over and dismisses them. There's so much below the surface of the characters that it is revealed in these little tiny moments that you pick up on once you're looking past the absurdist humor or the horror or the dark comedy.
Yeah, there is something childlike in a very gothic way about Korbal Broach. And he is this combination of innocence, perhaps, with this with serial killing sociopathy, if you could put those things together. But yeah, fascinating character. But there's a lot more, of course, to this story as well. And
Well,
maybe we can.
We set this up because obviously this follows on as almost a direct sequel to Blood Follows.
Yeah.
That
Right.
this is after they have left Lamentable Mall, and it's entirely shipboard. Like we're talking 18th, 19th century ghost story at sea. So we have all of that. If you think Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and they going through the ice, or in Dracula, the ship that has Dracula on board and everyone starts dying, we're getting that similar sort of vibe to it. These are horrific things that are happening. And it's not just one horrific thing. There are multiple horrific things that are overlapping, but not necessarily directly related. And then we have that typical Malazan, Eriksonian, Esselmontian convergence of a lot of things sort of coalescing together at the end in a completely unexpected way.
Yeah. Can we get those sort of sorted out, actually? So in a way, they brought Lamentable Mall with them in the form of the nails that they used to repair the ship, which were sold to them by Emancipor's two buddies.
Exactly, yeah.
Right? So you've got all these spirits there, and then you've got this thing called a leech or whatever, and this thing seems to have combined several elements into it. One of which is this, what is that monster called that goes inside
the Jawlig?
Yeah. Okay, so the Lich has absorbed that particular monster along with a whole bunch of other elements. I mean, you've got these disparate elements that are all shoved into these two, and of course you've got Korbal Broach's baby, his child, whatever you want to call it, which has elements of some of the ghosts that are in the nails. So they're like, oh, I feel my spleen somewhere, and you know.
what is it? Like my spleen is eating me?
Yeah, somebody's eating my spleen, and then you've got the monsters that are in the water as well. You've got the Denrabi in the water, and the sharks. And then, of course, you've got the monsters on the ship who are Bauchelain and Korbal Broach, and you've got poor Emancipor trying to survive all this and everything else. And you've got the elements of the human elements on the ship too, right?
And you have the monsters from the statues that belonged to the supernatural god that's arriving. There's a lot going on.
So have we got that all sorted out now?
Oh, and we forgot the undead, dead, possessive mother in the crow's nest.
Yeah. I mean, that is just the most random, funny element. And it turns out, of course, it's the daughter who is the mother actually alive or not? I don't know. Is it?
No, she's dead.
She's dead, I know, but is she somehow beyond the grave speaking to her daughter, or is the daughter just having this dialogue in her own head? I'm not sure, but I love it.
The second time I read it, it seemed like the daughter was imagining it, because whenever the mother's voice is mentioned, Erikson almost says her voice was like the waves and the wind and blah, blah, blah. So he kind of mixes it in with this girl just interpreting the natural sounds around her as her mother trying to speak to her. That's how I saw it.
But when Emancipor is trapped, no, I say trapped in the crow's nest with her because it really does feel like he's trapped in the crow's nest with her. But the mother speaks to him. But is that the daughter putting on the mother's voice? So are we getting a Friday the 13th psycho kind of imagining?
Yeah, psycho, that's what I thought it was, yeah.
So there's this psychological aspect to this horror playing on the horror tropes of, is this young girl insane? But because it's a fantasy world, is it her mother's spirit actually in her head? And there's an element of possession I think there's enough ambiguity. I honestly don't know, because when I read it, I couldn't work it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's crazy.
Go on.
No, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so can we just talk about how the sort of, especially when Bauchelain and Korbal Broach are on the ship itself, right? And when Bauchelain is telling emanciparies to kind of get ready for the crisis and all that, this story to me is one of the few times that Bauchelain seemed a little worried as well. He did not seem as confident as he did in the first and the third books. He was almost like, we will all be sorely tested. Whereas in the first and the third one, especially in the third one, he has absolutely no concerns at all that he's out of his depth here. Whereas here, this was I might have been imagining it, but there was almost a strand of subtle self-doubt in Bauchelain I saw in this one that I didn't in the others.
No, one of the things that I think is interesting about this is I think A, you're absolutely right. But B, think of where they are. In all of the other stories that we see Bauchelain in, where he is confident, he's on dry land. He can access his warrens, he can do various things. He has all of his servants near, his demonic slaves that he can summon. He has preparations in place. Here, he is entirely at the mercy of the fact they are on the sea. Now, when we see them traveling elsewhere, they almost invariably travel by carriage because Bauchelain does not like traveling via water. And we know in the Malazan world, there is difficulty accessing your warren when you're in open water. He is trapped on a boat. There's no easy escape. He's in a confined space. There's nowhere to maneuver. He is surrounded by denrabi and sharks. These are not...
And it's mating season as well.
And it's mating season as well. That in this, he does not have access to easy ways to escape. Now, we also know by this stage that obviously like Bauchelain and Korbal Broach are soul taken. They can transform into ravens. But, or sorry, crows. But how far can a crow fly? And if you're out in the middle of the sea, is that going to be far enough? So even their backup plan to get away is not available. So how nervous would you feel when plan number one, your reliance on magic, is going to be reduced? Plan number two, your easy escape plan is not necessarily going to work. Plan number three, you can't transform into your other form to fly away because you might make it. All of these things limit your options. And then you add in a confined space where you have all of these other people around that might get in your way. That you can understand why potentially he's a wee bit nervous.
And speaking
just
of
a wee bit,
just a little. And speaking of the locale of the story, can we talk about the title? Because there is so much packed into this title, so many possible meanings we can take, directions we can go. So the Lees of Laughter's End. So first of all, I think we were talking earlier before we were recording with AP, what exactly a Lee is. So a Lee being an AP, feel free to jump in here at any point, but...
have you forgotten already? But if we talk about the leeward side of a ship, so a nautical term being related to the wind and where the wind is in relation to where you are.
Right.
But you can also have, I think you can use it, the lee as in the dregs, the leftovers, the lees of something, like the dregs of something. Then you have Laughter's End, obviously in reference to a place like at Lamentable Mall, but the end of laughter, Laughter's End. This is where you get to once the laughter stops. So there are a lot of nuances and plays on words, which we find typical in Erikson's work, and is even more exaggerated here because obviously with parody and satire, plays on words, puns, hiding multiple meanings, it very, very common in parody and satire.
Yeah.
It's also read, isn't it? When you get there and the myth is that that's male's blood or something like that. Don't they have a discussion like that as well? That male's this useless god who can't hear the whatever the voices of his devotees and stuff like that, which is hilarious for people who've read the other books as well. But I think there's even, it turns red, and Bauchelain even says that that it's literally the blood of a god. So it's not a myth, it's the blood of a god, which is why the spirits trapped in the nails are now a threat because blood has power, as we all know. And this literally is the blood of male that's flowing through the ocean. And I wasn't too sure what the deal was there, but that was all really interesting. I hope someone can piece all that together.
Well, I'm sure someone who has better nautical knowledge than me will be able to piece a lot of this together. But it is one of those novels. I have to admit, like, my favorite of the Bauchelain and Korbal Broach novels is Crackpot Trail. Not for the reason that you're probably thinking of, but because the metatextual satire. And I love that corresponds very directly to my type of humor. And the body horror in this is something that I find very difficult. Even classic horror movies like Alien there are certain scenes in it that I'm uncomfortable with. But then when you get to something like John Carpenter's The Thing, I'm really uncomfortable. I do not like nor enjoy that sort of body horror. That is not my thing. But there is so much in this that I thought the throwaway lines about Briv, Briv, and Briv.
Oh yeah.
And the fact that we hear this all the time in fantasy. If a fantasy character has a similar name to another character, either in that book or even in a 10-book series, it's how can these people have the same name? And I was just thinking back to when I was at school, and in my year in primary school, I think there were 12 people called Paul in my year. 12 called Paul. And you have a problem in a fantasy world of millions where people may have similar names. And so here we have on this ship, Briv, Briv, and Briv. And it's clearly Erikson just having fun with the idea that everyone in a fantasy world has a unique single name.
And he takes it beyond that as well. There's a scene where someone screams and there's a murder that's happened, and they show that it's Briv who's gone missing. But then they figure out that it wasn't Briv because there was another Briv here. And we find out later that there are multiple Brivs that just keep adding on to the cast. Perfect.
Well, because the one Briv was actually, what was it, Gordo? Or I forget his alter ego name. But they figured out, oh, wait, Briv isn't missing because Briv is actually Gordo when Gordo is cross-dressing. So,
I know,
yeah.
But it's what I actually love about this is, and again, this is one of these really subtle things. When because I'm fairly sure about this, but when Gordo is Gordo and therefore male, referred to with male pronoun, when Gordo is Briv and female, referred to with female pronoun.
Right.
And the sailors on board have no problem with this.
Right.
And when one of them says, "But didn't you sleep with her?" And it's like, and how could you not know? And the joke is not sleeping with someone who is transsexual. It's the fact that you slept with them and you didn't recognize this.
Right.
And none of the humor is aimed at the her. It is aimed at the other person, because they are all absolutely accepting that, sometimes they're male, sometimes they're female. And one of them even says, "No, there's one of those on every ship." Right. Because this is just absolutely accepted. And when that is sort of slipped into the to an absurdist body horror parody comedy, whatever this is, this complicated little tiny book, and you go, they're just these wonderful moments of commentary where this is just a world where people are just accepting of things that challenge us.
Yeah. Yep. Brilliantly so. So speaking of some challenging elements, is it time for us to?
I think, okay, yeah, let's talk about this. For those of you watching, there is one scene in this that some fans find very controversial. Other people see it in the light of everything else that's gone on. We're going to discuss it now, and it involves reference to rape, date rape, and sexual violence. Mm-hmm. if that is not your thing, if you don't want to watch, thank you so much for watching until now. But we are going to talk about it. It is in the book, and that's what we're moving on to now. So this scene, I know some fans have a problem with this scene. And personally, I think in the context of the novel, in the context of the tone and style of the novel, in the context of everything else that we've seen, I don't see this as a particularly controversial scene. No more so than when Korbal Broach cuts the ear off someone to go fishing, when people are being eaten alive, when we see dismemberment and body horror and all of the other things, when the fact that these are necromancers who are serial killers and murderers, when in other novels we have jokes made at the expense of Emancipar Reese's substance abuse and drug addiction. Mm-hmm. That all of these things are presented in this. Do you have to find every element funny? No. But I don't see this scene in particular as standing out in any way to be controversial. But what I will point out is that, interestingly, Erikson actually takes time in the aftermath of this sequence to not only have the victim of the rape, the sea captain, name it as rape. So the author takes time to step in and actually have this discussion. So Erikson is not sidestepping the issue.
Right.
He addresses it head on. He also has Bauchelain admit that what he did was wrong. And again, this is a character who has no problem burning down a city, who has no problem ordering people killed when they're inconvenient, who has no problem enslaving demons. And he looks at this situation and says, yes, the captain has every right to be upset.
Yeah.
And so you have the author stepping in to give Bauchelain voice to some opinion that is somewhat out of character for Bauchelain. Yeah. And then when Korbal Broach turns up, and we know Korbal Broach's solution to everything, which is kill them. But Bauchelain defends the sea captain and says that she has every right to be upset, every right to be annoyed.
Right.
And so I think that's the first important thing to point out about this. That yes, Erikson has included it as he included everything else, but this is actually one thing that clearly he feels strongly enough about that he has authorial insertion to discuss it.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I think that you hit on a bunch of important points there, and I agree with you, first of all. And I believe that is important in literature to have things happen that happen in the real world that may not be pleasant, but these are things that we wrestle with, that we struggle with. And it is also important to deal with those consequently, not to just throw them in. And you pointed out, and I noticed that as well, that Erikson Bauchelain is actually talking to another character, but it feels like he has turned toward me, the reader, and is addressing me directly at this moment. And that is Erikson definitely taking the time to deal with this in a way that I think is actually a very important thing, that you deal with the consequences of these types of things. We've talked about it as well when we talk about House of Chains, and we talked about Karsa's journey as well. So I appreciate that Erikson takes on these difficult things, these difficult themes, and also takes the time to deal with them in a manner that I think ultimately can generate some very important conversations. So I think he handles it well here. I also felt like you that it was a scene that did not stand out to me, except that he actually does have Bauchelain talk to us about it. But it didn't. I confessed before, I was laughing my ass off at some guy having his foot chopped off and his eye poked out and his nose cut off and his ears. I was laughing hard at that. So, exactly what you were saying, AP. I'm just agreeing with you. I don't know what Ruthan Badd thinks about all this.
So, I mean, firstly, we've got to also sort of acknowledge the fact that Bauchelain was completely drugged. It's not a conventional sexual assault scene where a male with a lot of power sort of subjugates a female because of some kind of need to control or sexual pleasure or whatever. He was drugged with a with something that's meant to, let's face it, arouse the likes of Casa, right, rather than him. So that's one thing. Another, I guess the more important point is that this is the strength and the weakness of slapstick comedy, in that the humor is universal, but the cultural values by which that will be evaluated will always be kind of isolated. So in my part of the world, in my mother tongue, as in Tamil, I can show you dozens of scenes from movies and television shows just in the last 4 or 5 years, where the trivialization of kind of sexual assault for humor is consistently played off for gags. A scene like this, nobody would even notice in a culture like in a culture like mine, right? Particularly if you look at the sort of the entertainment that we have, and with slapstick itself, sometimes for that effect to be reached, unfortunately, these things happen. One example, if either of you have seen the movie Airplane, Erikson commented on one of my videos that he's a big fan of that. There's this hilarious scene there where the air hostess is freaking out, and one person shakes her and says, "Calm down," and she moves away. Leslie Nielsen comes and says, "Calm down." He shakes her and then he slaps her, and the next person comes up and slaps her again, and they pan out and there's a big line behind them. There's one guy with boxing gloves, another with a baseball bat. Now that is slapstick humor. That if you wanted to be not to kind of plagiarize from my Healthy Dead video, but if you want to be too self-righteous about these things, slapstick humor generally tends to be a very easy target, because slapstick humor depends on the universality of that humor to work, because you are dealing in physical actions. I mean, you falling face first and breaking your nose is something that I can empathize with, and you can, all of us can empathize with, sitting in 3 different continents, as we're literally in 3 different continents, and that is something that will translate. So that's just my take on it. My take on that scene. Look, I'm not a big fan of that scene, to be honest. I don't think it sort of added much to the humor or whatever. But in terms of the slapstick element itself, we do need to understand that imposing contemporary or certain regional cultural and traditional norms, I don't want to bang on with my non-Western shtick, but I think it's kind of relevant here, right? Which is that you are trying to judge a universal type of humor with a certain contemporary cultural position. And that will always lead to people misunderstanding or sort of getting grossed out by what's actually happening, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think both those perspectives are very, very valuable. And Ruthan, I would say it is not non-Western shtick. It is a very important point that needs brought across, is that there's more than one culture in the world. There's more than one way to approach things. And I, for one, am very glad that you consistently comment on videos and correct an implicit bias or an explicit bias that I may have in, say, my analysis of literature, because I am part of a specific Western tradition or a specific way of looking at literature. And you've always been very forthright and very honest about coming at it and going, but think about it from a different perspective. And, you know, that is always valuable, looking at things from a different perspective. And it is, you know, like a key aspect of this. And we even mentioned it in relation to the character of Korbal Broach, that, yes, on the one hand, there's a superficial reaction to that. But when you start thinking about it, it's a lot more complex. It's a lot more nuanced.
Right.
And that scene, or the scene that we're discussing, very particularly, there's a short story by Tom Goodwin, a very famous one, called The Cold Equations, which is essentially a narrative trap for the reader, where how Goodwin actually designs the story sets you up for the fact that there is no way out apart from to agree with the murder of a young girl. And what we have in this particular scene is the sea captain is absolutely innocent of consent, because although she consents during the act, that consent was forced by a drug. So she doesn't consent. She was drugged. And therefore, that's why Erikson has the sea captain name it as Rip and Bauchelain name it as Rip. No one objects to that characterization. But interestingly, Bauchelain, as Ruthan points out, was drugged. And he didn't choose to consume this drug. He was drugged without his knowledge. So if the captain is not able to consent, and therefore her consent is nullified by the drug, is that the same thing that we apply to Bauchelain's actions? Is he to be judged on his actions even though this is a drug that affects them? Mm-hmm. And then you have the fact that the person who drugged Bauchelain and set it all up is a manservant, but he didn't intend for any of this to happen.
Right.
And so it is a narrative fictitious trap that has been set up that is actually a very complex ethical position to try and examine, because date rape is a horrendous thing that still predominates and dominates cultural exchanges, particularly at universities, which obviously, like Philip and I have significant experience. And I know in the past I have had students confide in me about certain issues to do with this. Yeah. And this is still an issue. And again, I think because Erikson uses satire and parody and dark humor, and he takes these very dark looks at humanity, that this isn't controversial to me, apart from the fact that the very idea of rape is controversial, particularly for a male author to use. Mm-hmm. And I think, and I may be biased because I'm a man, but I honestly think that we need more men to be aware of the repercussions, yep. B, to stop sort of sweeping it under the carpet and actually confront it. Mm-hmm. If people disagree that they don't like it in this type of book, that, you know, that's absolutely fine. You don't have to like every single aspect of the novel. If you're not interested in body horror, you shouldn't be reading this book. Right. But to call it a controversial scene, and right. I think that's where I object to that, because I see it as addressing the same taboos and the same social norms and the same problems that he addresses in all of the other books and in other parts of this book.
And if there's humor in the scene at all, and I admit I didn't laugh as much during this part, but if there's humor in it, it's in the lack of intention. It's in the lack, there's no intentionality on the part of anyone. As we said, Manservant does not mean he's getting out a bottle of what he thinks is wine to give to Bauchelain, who has requested some wine, and accidentally gives him this, I guess it's blood wine or whatever it's called, which is what causes this reaction. And it's in the lack of control. There is something humorous. And again, I don't think to laugh at something is to trivialize it necessarily. I think often we use laughter to analyze, we use laughter to understand. So the lack of control is certainly something very human as well. And we see this character who's normally very controlled, Bauchelain, who completely loses it. And so there is something, I think, that is worthy of looking into there as well. So there's a lot more to this scene than just, oh, controversial scene. Yeah.
I know. And I would raise one last point about this, because obviously Bauchelain is presented with two people. One, a woman who he says, she's a woman, I can rape her. And the other was Emancipar. And he said, because he isn't gay, he would have murdered Emancipar. Right. So if his choices are murder or rape, and I'm not saying either one is good. I'm not saying that either one is a perfect choice. But that's why I was talking about it in terms of a narrative trap that is being explored. That you know, everyone agrees murder is bad, rape is bad. But if you're in that position, what the Sophie's choice,
Yeah.
what do you do? And that's why it's very easy to say, oh, rape is bad, all rape is bad. We know that. That's not controversial. That's not a problem. Like, no one has an issue with that. But other things are bad as well. So this is where we get into the nuance that I think underlies a lot of Erikson's work, which is the nuance of, yes, we have these things that are declarative, but there's let's actually put them in contrast. Are all bad things equally bad? And as soon as you start thinking about it, is a very uncomfortable question, because we react so viscerally to both those specific offenses. Those are things that are absolute evil, and we react viscerally to it. We react emotively to it. And to be asked to sort of put them next to each other and go, okay, you choose, puts us in a very uncomfortable position. And it is not suggesting either one is a good choice. But when you have to think about it, he's not asking you to make the decision. It happened to Bauchelain, not us. But it does raise complex moral questions. And again, that is part of the purpose of satire. It's part of the purpose of parody. Yes. When Jonathan Swift wrote about eating babies to feed the Irish in a modest proposal, are we meant to, oh, well, that's barbaric? You're like, well, yes, eating babies is barbaric. That was the whole point. But again, you know, we live in a different time. So
can I just add one more point that I've mentioned in some of my other videos and all that, which is that depictions of sexual violence in a literary form, at least in my opinion, they become a problem when they are exploitative. So even in a scene like this, all we see is Bauchelain saying, not you, right? And Rhys closes the door and that's all we see. There's nothing about the swell of her breasts and the thickness of her lips and the sultriness of her eyes and things like that. There's none of that. That is purely used as a gag, as an emancipator Rhys fucked up. And now Bauchelain is taken out of the story and Korbal Broach is now taking on the antagonist by himself, while Bauchelain is trapped in this kind of blunder that emancipator Rhys has created for him. And as Korbal Broach takes care of the ghost that's on board the ship, Bauchelain then races on board the deck to fight the incoming god. So that was purely a sort of a gag of Rhys messing up his job, which is always funny.
Well, and weirdly enough, I was watching a video about a legal case involving authors, and there was a lot of controversy over this because it was an author allegedly issuing takedown notices to another author for breach of copyright for what, from my limited understanding, is a type of erotica that is rape erotica based on werewolf porn. And firstly, I was shocked to find out that there was werewolf porn. And then I was shocked to find out that there's erotica that is based on werewolf porn, and that there was enough of it that that there were multiple authors then suing each other, or allegedly suing each other. I don't understand the full ins and outs of it. But it turns out that this particular subgenre of romance novel is actually all about rape. It's it is focusing on this. And I had mentioned this to my wife, and my wife went, yeah, there are whole subgenres of romance about the pirate king's daughter being kidnapped and drugged and raped and falling in love with another pirate, or the princess. There are entire subgenres of romance where rape is used as a romantic fantasy trope. And I was unaware of this because this was not covered in my literary degrees.
Really?
But these things exist. And when I had mentioned it to a female friend, they just looked at me, and I think their expression was, oh, sweet summer child, there are things on the internet that you just don't know about. And apparently, there's a lot more of that very specific, the fantasy about rape, about the sexualization of rape, about putting rape in that context. And there are professional authors, there are published works, there are fan sites, there's fan fiction, and there's this entire ecosystem of these various literary subgenres all about that topic that I find eye-opening that these things existed.
Mm-hmm.
And so suddenly that gave me a different context for a lot of what we talk about when we see sexual assault and things being used in fiction. Because while like we can find these scenes deeply problematic, apparently there are entire subgenres where these scenes are what people are after, and they have publishers. That there's a lot more to this than I had imagined.
They make the Bauchelain books sound like family-friendly stories. I mean, come on, werewolf rape porn, really?
Well, there's nothing new under the sun, my friends.
Yeah. Oh, my lichen fetish, my lichen forced fetish. My God.
Oh well, but you know, even when you think of like something like Twilight was a fascinating example to do a feminist literary analysis on for my undergraduates at the time, because I pointed out to them that, you know, it's pointed out in the books that Edward has no pulse. So if he has no pulse, he has no blood pressure. If he has no blood pressure, he can't get an erection. So on the one hand, like vampires are all impotent. Male vampires are all impotent. But on the other hand, you have, when you find out that Edward and Bella, you know, they're talking about their feelings for one another, and he refers back to the first time that they met, where they meet in the classroom, he smells her, she smells delicious, and he runs out of the room, and she thinks that he's being sick or something. It's weird. It turns out that night, and then for the rest of all of these other nights, he broke into her room, stood over her bed, watching her sleep, trying to decide whether to rip out her throat and drink all of her blood, i.e. murder her, or rape her. And this is presented in these books as this sweet romantic love at first sight.
Very successful books, aren't they?
Because this is one of the tropes of romance fiction. This is one of the tropes of that particular style of romance fiction, that it's being used. The fact that Edward is like 100 years old, the older man and the young girl, is again something that in real life we would consider quite creepy, but in fiction is a trope, is a thing that is explored. So, you know, context is everything in these.
Well, we could get into the nuances of vampire Viagra, I'm sure, but I mean, probably we should be wrapping up our discussion.
Philip, I was just, as you said that, I was just going to say Western civilization is doomed. My God, you guys can keep.
Well, you know, vampire Viagra, there's a new market to exploit. But
here we go.
Okay, so guys, Philip, Ruthan Badd, thank you so much for joining me. So Philip, would you like to sign off?
Oh, you know, thank you so much, guys. I enjoyed this thoroughly. I always love talking to you, AP. I mean, I keep saying it, but my love for these books keeps growing, and it's because of our conversations. So thank you so much. I just love learning. And Ruthan Badd, I am so happy finally we get the chance to get together for these discussions, and we've definitely got to do this again sometime. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom.
Guys, this was an unbelievable honor for me, and this actually exceeded my expectations. I've been looking forward to this for months, and this was actually even better than what I was expecting it to be. I've come a long way since I complained to Ishka that Philip Chase has brought in some editor of Erikson, and this guy makes the rest of us look like a Neanderthal. So I finally made it. Thank you, Philip. You made it happen.
What has happened is you go, no, I've seen more of what AP does, and he doesn't make us look like Neanderthals. He's an idiot.
Oh, hey, come on, AP. There's that modesty there. I don't like that.
But I would have to say, gentlemen, thank you so much. It really is a genuine pleasure to be able to talk to you both, to have interesting discussions about literature, about these books, about the books that we love, about aspects of the books that we don't love. The fact that we can have these conversations is such a joy and such an experience for me that I treasure. So thank you both so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. For everyone watching, I will put links in the description below for the other videos. Thank you very much, and I will see you in the next one.